Our first speaker is Dr. Kristy Duran. She is a sixth-generation native to the San Luis Valley. As a professor at Colorado Mesa University, she worked with the CSU Extension Office to create the Ute Ethnobotany Garden. As a professor of biology at Adams State University for 10 years, she pursued her interest in ethnobotany and recently wrote a chapter on the ethnobotany of the San Luis Valley. Dr. Duran is currently the faculty director of undergraduate research and a professor of biology at Metro State University in Denver, where she is dedicated to equity, inclusion, and student success. Thank you. Welcome.
Whoops. Forgot it slopes. Is there a slide advance? Oh, here it is. Is this it? Let's see. Yes, it is. All right. I like to move around a little bit, so I'm going to take this off. So thank you so very much for having me. I'm really excited to talk about ethnobotany of the San Luis Valley. It's something that I grew up with without really knowing that I grew up with it. And then when I went on to become a professor, I never realized that I was interested in plants until I was a graduate student and started working with pinyon pine and dwarf mistletoe, and realized I got very excited about plants. I call myself a backdoor botanist because as an undergrad, I never took a plant class. I kind of came in the back way. So I'm really excited. I hope I have my timer here so that hopefully I won't go over time. All right, so here's a nice map of the San Luis Valley. The San Luis Valley is huge. It is about the size of Connecticut. And what's really neat about the San Luis Valley is that all of the kind of ecosystems can be represented in the San Luis Valley, because you've got the valley floor, which is a high alpine desert. And then you've got, of course, grasslands, footlands, and then all the way up to 14ers around here. So long before there were names to all of the little cities and towns in the San Luis Valley, other people lived here. So we have long history of Native Americans living in the San Luis Valley and using a lot of the resources in the San Luis Valley. So using plants for food, for textiles, for medicines. And then the Hispanos came into the valley, bringing some of their own knowledge of the plants that they knew from either Spain or from Mexico. And the two sort of fused. They took some of the things that they knew, what they learned from the Native Americans in the area, and really fused to use the plants for their own. So the way I want to organize this talk is thinking about the San Luis Valley as the different ecotypes, right? So we've got the high alpine desert at the valley floor. Then we've got a lot of wetlands and riparian areas. And as we move up, we've got lots of different plants in those. And I want to I'm trying to select only one or two, maybe sometimes three plants from each of the different things to talk a little bit more about. So I'm going to start by talking about the riparian and the wetlands, and then move over to talk about grasslands. And then as we move up closer to the different shrublands. And then we have the foothills with the pinyon juniper and scrub oak. Further up in elevation, we've got the montane up to the subalpine fir, and then of course the tundra. So I'm going to go through, kind of move up from the valley floor all the way up to the top, choosing a couple of plants along the way to talk about. There we go. All right. So we're going to first start our journey in the wetlands, the riparian area. So I want to start by talking about some of the plants that are kind of common to this area. So we've got the cottonwood and the willows. Right? So cottonwood in Spanish is álamo. And so we are here in Alamosa, which really means cottonwood grove. The willows is called jarita. And so jarita, you might be familiar with La Jara. So La Jara is a little town about 15 miles south of here and also gets its name from the willows. So we're in a very botanical place. It's great. So both of these plants, willow particularly, has got a precursor to salicylic acid, which is the active ingredient in aspirin. And so it is a plant that has been used for a long time for kind of aches, for headaches, just to chew on the bark. Also, chewing on the leaves is said to help preserve the teeth, so to kind of prevent them from falling out. Some other really important plants that we find in riparian areas are the cattails and the horsetails. The cattails is a plant that's been used by Native Americans as a food source for a really long time. All plant parts of that plant are edible. It's really starchy there in the middle. The pollen, which I find the most interesting, is really very high in protein and was used to in some of the dough to make the kind of cakes a little bit yellowish in color and are, like I said, high in protein. The horsetails have been used by Native Americans and Hispanos in a tea to treat urinary tract infections. And also the tea can be drunk to help prevent osteoporosis. And what's interesting, they have found, just recent research has shown that the silica in plants, and the horsetails have a lot of silica in them, actually helps preventing calcium from chelating out of the bones. So it does prevent osteoporosis. Of course, as I said, I tried to pick one or two and it's been hard. The only one I really wanted to talk about here is Inmortal. And so Inmortal, or Asclepias. So Asclepias is named for a Greek expert in medicinal plants, Asclepias. Inmortal is the Hispano name for this particular plant. And I interviewed a couple of people a few years ago to talk about these different plants. I interviewed my tío Leo Armenta. He said, and I quote, Inmortal is used for everything. So this is really one of the things that was used for colds, stomach aches, fevers. And you'll find that a lot of the plants I talk about have those particular uses for fevers and for stomach aches. But one of the things that was interesting is the powder is often used and mixed with water to help with congestion. So really as an expectorant. Also to help with shortness of breath. The bits or pieces of the root, the powder itself, is sometimes inhaled to induce violent sneezing, which will help alleviate sinusitis and other kinds of nose colds. The other thing is that it's sometimes mixed with osha as sort of a preventative of any kind of diseases. So really just to maintain health, Inmortal and osha, which I'll be talking about osha a little bit later. There we go. All right, so as we move away from the wetlands and the riparian areas, we move into the grasslands. And so some of the plants that are pretty common here in grasses, my slides are being really slow. There we go. So we have at the top blue grama, is a grass that we can find here. the squirrel tail, which is down the bottom, and then of course the needle and thread. But the really large one is the one I want to talk about, and that is the Indian rice grass, which is just, to me, I think one of the more beautiful grasses. It's just got such this delicate kind of daintiness with this very large seeds. And this was something that was used by Native Americans as a flour ground into like a cornmeal. They would, gently parch the seeds to kind of take off the shell so that just the seed is remaining. And then that was really ground into a meal. That's a plant that wasn't used by the Hispanos, but it was a really important plant for the Native Americans when talking about the grasses lands. I don't know where I need to point. There we go. Okay, the shrublands. I feel like the shrublands might be one of my favorites. These are the 4 major types of shrubs. We've got the greasewood, which is kind of the second one here. So the greasewood is found here in the valley along playas and drainages, places where the soils are a little bit more saline. We have the 4, sorry, I'm going to move over this way. We've got the sagebrush. The sagebrush is really pretty common in the sort of extremes of the valley. So the northern part and the southern part, also kind of in the western part. It's probably one of the more dominant ones. The far end, we have rabbit brush. Rabbit brush is the one that has those really bright yellow flowers in the fall. So like around now, you might see them, or they might have already stopped being quite bursting with the yellow. Those ones you tend to find in disturbed areas, along roadsides, also other places of drainages. And it's interesting, if you could drive around the valley, you find places where you have the dominant shrub changes. Sometimes the dominant shrub will be the sagebrush. Sometimes it'll be the rabbit brush. The one we don't see as much, but it is here in the valley, is the 4-winged saltbush. And that one is more in a kind of a narrow band along before we get to the pinyon juniper in some parts of the valley. My favorite thing about that particular plant is it's dioecious. So it's got a female plant and a male plant, but depending on the conditions, it can change sex to be the different one. I think that's a really pretty cool thing about that one. Again, I wasn't going to talk about that plant, but I like it. All right, but the one I really want to talk about is the big sagebrush, or Artemisia tridentata. The Hispanos refer to this as chamizo hediondo. And this is a plant that has a lot of significance for lots of different people. This is one that's used widely by Native Americans. It's for a lot of their spiritual practices. It's one that's used kind of for smudging, but also has some medicinal properties. It's been used as, of course, to treat fevers and stomach aches in some cases, as I've mentioned, a lot of these plants do. This one has very strong tasting. Has anyone ever had a tea of chamizo hediondo? Yeah, it's really, you have to, the directions are that you sip it very slowly to prevent the gag reflex. Yeah, the gag reflex is real. It's really very, very strong, which is why then it's not surprising that it's used to kill intestinal worms. Because it's really very, very strong. This was one that we used, I remember having as a tea as a child, the refrigerator. And it was just so bad tasting. I had such a bad memory associated with it because we would drink it for colds, that when I got older and we'd go on hikes and other people would say, how doesn't that, the chamizos smell beautiful? I just kept thinking about that gag reflex. But it was, we had it in the refrigerator mainly for my mom, as my mom is a diabetic. And so one of the uses, or the recommended uses, was to help stabilize blood sugar. So I know that's why she drank it. She swears it doesn't work, so she stopped using it. But I know that is one of the things that it was used for. I've also heard that they take the leaves and steep them in brandy as a way to drink them that way. I think that's a better way to stomach this particular plant. Right. The other one I wanted to talk just a little bit about is the broom snakeweed, the Geuresia. This one has also known medical properties. This was known way back, in Spain. It's actually named for a Spanish botanist. This whole genus is. Cerothrae refers to kind of being broom-like. And so the Spanish name is Escoba de Vibra, which is a broom of the witch. And it has been used, Native Americans have used it to take the branches and kind of put them together and make a broom out of them. The leaves also have medicinal properties. They're used in a tea to help, again, like I said, treat fevers. Also used with post-birth to reduce uterine swelling. But the leaves have a lot of tannins and saponins in them. And so taking them at really large quantities can be toxic. And another thing, depending on where they're grown, they could also pose some problems because it can take up some of the things from there. All right. I think that was the only other things I wanted to say about this particular plant. I'm going to trade out. Yeah, I think this one is dead. Is that one working? Okay. While he's doing that, I wanted to also mention that it is important to think about where things are growing when harvesting them. The thing I failed to mention earlier, talking about the horsetails, is that they can take up some of the things from the soil that can be bad. So for example, growing in places where there's a lot of inorganic nitrogen, that buildup can get into the plant and then also not good to consume. So places where kind of high agricultural areas where there would be a lot of inorganic nitrogen. All right, so then we move up to the pinyon juniper and scrub oak, which is probably my second favorite zone. So the thing I studied was pinyon. Is my favorite tree. So here I have a kind of a representative of a lot of the different plants we'd find in this area. So mountain mahogany, snowberry, serviceberry, scrub oak in some of the places, but in other places, the most dominant in this foothills region, kind of before we go the transition between shrubs and moving up to montane, we have the pinyon juniper. So we have our pinyon and then our juniper. Let's go ahead and move on to our next slide to talk more about Pinus edulis. So the really best part of this tree, arguably, is the nut or the pinon. And so this was also something we grew up eating. My grandfather always had sacks and sacks of it. He loved to go out and collect it. So we always had some pinon. It is probably one of the most nutritious nuts. So per 100 grams of the nuts, there are 31 grams of complete protein, more than any other nut or seeds. It's also really high in vitamins A, C, D, and E, and also has a lot of thiamine or vitamin B1. It has more than 2 times the amount of B1 than animal organs, which tend to be really high in vitamin B. So it's a really, really great nut, and it also tastes delicious. Okay. Let's move on to the next slide. Keeping with the pinon tree, the resin is also used quite a bit. It's called trementina. And so the trementina is also used for like a solve. So kind of mixed up with some other compounds to put on wounds to prevent infection. It's also sometimes used to treat acne. It's supposed to draw out pus from wounds and kind of draw out the pus from the acne. Also, if it's caused by like a splinter, it's supposed to help also draw out the splinter itself. And then the gum is just used to chew. My mom was just telling me a story that when they were kids, they used to chew it quite a bit, but it was super sticky and it seemed like it would get all over their teeth more than anything. But it was also used to treat bad breath, according to my Tio Leo. Let's go on to the next slide. Showy 4 o'clock, which is one of the most beautiful plants in that area. So Maravilla is the Hispano name for this particular plant. In addition to being used again to treat things like fevers and stomach issues, my Tio Leo was telling me that people often take the root and chew the root before mealtime to help suppress the appetite when they are dieting, which I thought was interesting. All right, so we start to move up out of the foothills and then into the montane forests, into the mixed conifer. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So some of the common things that we'll see here are Doug fir, blue spruce, and the ponderosa pine. So the ponderosa pine, we heard these are ones that were used by Native Americans sometimes quite a bit as a staple, or not a staple, but used in usual times, but sometimes more in lean times. They would take pieces out to chew on the cambium. I eat the cambium, which is really high in vitamins, as well as so vitamin C and iron and zinc, and it had a really stable like a sugar kind of in a fiber matrix that helps sustain energy for long periods of time without really spiking the blood sugar and then crashing. Let's move on to the next slide. This is probably one of my also favorite plants. So this is woods rose, or Rosa castilla is what the flower is known as, and the rose hips are known as CoNPS. So Rosa castilla often used as an eye wash. So the flowers and leaves kind of put as an eye wash. Also the petals sometimes ground to put onto cold sores or fever blisters to help with that. The CoNPS, this is a new use that I heard from Alice Candy, is that sometimes it's ground up and then rolled in a cigarette and smoked to help treat sore throats. So that was an interesting one. Let's go to the next slide. But of course, one of my favorites is champa jelly, rosehip jelly, or jam. And this is something we grew up with. When I was a kid, every time this year, we'd go and pick champas with my grandma and my mom. And my grandma was a lot older, but she'd fill up the baskets much faster than the rest of us. And it makes a delicious jelly. And this is a tradition that has continued. So my son, a couple of years ago, we went out picking champas. The next slide is, the next image is my dad. It's like he loves, whenever he hears there's a champa bush or someone invites him, he's out there. As a matter of fact, last weekend, or maybe it was just a few days ago, he went picked a whole bunch of champa. So when I go home back to my parents' house, I'm going to help them clean it. And that's kind of drying, and we're going to make some champa jelly. But yeah, it's his favorite. The other thing I'm going to talk just a little bit about is plumajillo. So plumajillo, again, in addition to helping treat fevers, the leaves are sometimes rubbed onto wounds to help stop the bleeding. I'm getting close to time here, so I can remind myself. So the leaves are used for that. So Achillea, this is named for Achilles, because it's the myth, according to mythology, that Achilles had sort of discovered or was taught the medicinal properties and used this plant in the battlefield to help treat the wounded, and particularly to help with the bleeding, right? Prevent the bleeding. Let's go on to move up to the subalpine spruce fir. And so on our next slide, these are just some of the variety of plants that we'd see up there. So since I'm getting close to time, I'm just going to move up to Osha. So Osha is one that you probably have heard of. This one has lots of different medicinal properties. The root is often chewed on to help with, again, colds, to help with fevers. It has been shown to have lots of different properties. So it has antibacterial properties, antiviral, and antifungal. And it's often called bear root because bears are often roll in the, I've seen kind of frolicking and rolling in these plants when they come out of hibernation. And it's believed this is a way to kind of get rid of anything that might be growing on their fur. So any fungi that I've gone on their fur. It is also, the leaves are dried and kind of added to everything. And the practice is not to just dry them out in the sun, but to dry them in the shade. It's supposed to keep them more potent. And they found that recently might be a reason for this because plants that are grown, these particular plants that are grown in higher light environments have lower antibacterial properties than those that are in shaded environments. So these are often kind of put in food for general health. Of course, as you know, it's harvested in the fall, the time where all of the properties are going from the leaves down into the roots. That's when they are the most potent. It's also pinned onto clothing to help ward off infection. So this was something that was practiced whenever we had oral surgery or something. My grandmother would pin Osha onto us, and that would help prevent infections. And it's supposed to ward off things like rattlesnakes. I was really terrified of rattlesnakes as an undergrad. I did a desert field ecology class with when I was an undergrad, and we were supposed to see lots of rattlesnakes, which I was terrified. So I took some Osha with me. And our professor marked how strange that this was the year we hardly saw any rattlesnakes. So it does seem to work. Let's move on to the next slide. So I'm not going to talk about the tundra, the picture showing the tundra, but I want to talk just a little bit about the dunes, because that's one thing that's really unique about the San Luis Valley is we have the dry dunes. And so the next picture I want to talk about is the Hierba de San Juan. And so this is the evening primrose. This is one kind of like the woods rose that the flowers are going to ground up as a kind of to prevent infection, so on wound healing and also on cold sores. But there's been some recent research that backs up some of these medicinal properties of this particular plant. All right, so in addition to all of those areas, we have the valley floor that's got a lot of kind of disturbed areas. And so in our next slides, we've got some cultivated plants, also plants that are found in disturbed areas like lavender or alucima, chamomile, manzanilla, malvas, and alfalfa, which also has a lot of medicinal properties, or all of these are drunk as teas. And then the final slide, we've got the globe mallow, or the hierba de la negrita, which is used often as a shampoo to help prevent hair loss. It's also supposed to help keep the hair really very shiny and strong. And then, of course, some other things like purslane or verdolagas, which can be cooked up with onion and eaten, things that we also used to do growing up, as well as calites or lamb's quarters and other that are really very high in vitamin A. And so I'm going to move on to the last conclusion slide here. And so those are just kind of a walk through the San Luis Valley, kind of moving from the low to the high with some of my favorite plants and some of the uses that I remember using as a kid, as well as those that are really very well known and that have been used kind of for a really very, very long time. So thank you again for inviting me. The next thing to pop up is any questions if we have time.